My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the Assistant Director for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Advanced Studies program. I always see faces. There's a whole bunch of people I've never seen before that are here for this lecture, so that's really exciting. Before I get started, I thought I'd thank our sponsors of today's event. This is part of a residency that Ben Barson and Giselle Rodriguez are here for several days to do a bunch of different activities. And this week has been sponsored obviously by our program, as well as the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, the Chicana and Latina Studies Program, the Department of History, the Center for Humanities, the Department of Anthropology, Leopold's Books Bar Cafe, and the Lee Witter School of Music. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, amazing community.
Yep. So today, Ben is going to talk to us about his new book, Grassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies and the Jazz Commons. Ben is a composer, historian, and musicologist. His book, Grassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies and the Jazz Commons, thinks through jazz as an Afro-Atlantic art form deeply tied to the counter-plantation legacies of the Haitian Revolution and their echoes in the radical Reconstruction. His research rethinks migration, agency, and cultural resistance, and has published on topics ranging from the musical cultures of Chinese indenture in the late 19th century U.S. South to the legacy of Haitian migrants in early Louisianan blues. Barson's teaching encourages students to consider musical aesthetics and their associated production practices through an historic, interdisciplinary approach rooted in methodologies developed by scholars in Africana studies, musicology, cultural studies, and the Atlantic history from below. And as you can see, there's a copy of this book here, which I'm sure we could pass around. Would that be all right?
Absolutely. Yes, please do.
Also, I just wanted to mention that tonight, if you're inspired after you are here at this lecture today, you can see both Ben and Giselle are going to be performing at Leopold's Books Bar and Cafe here in Madison this evening, and that's going to be at 7 o'clock, and they're going to perform live with the Madison Blue Note Ensemble. And what else did I want to tell you? I think that's all. I'm just really thrilled that this finally worked out. We've been talking about planning for over a year, and they are here. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Wow. No, it's so heartwarming to be here to see just the multiple disciplines that we can weave together when we think about history and music and resistance as sort of a combined unity. And one of the things that brings us here today is that my partner and I, Giselle, were artists in residence here in 2020, which I don't know if you recall, but there was a major world historic pandemic that same year that severely interrupted our lives. And unfortunately, we could not conclude our residency in person, but we were able to do some really amazing virtual events in partnership with Professor Choi and Professor Johannes Wallman. And it was a really kind of interesting way to weave through the pandemic that also thought about these intersections of climate and ecology. And, you know, it was a very tense moment, if you recall, 2020, unlike now, which obviously we've resettled into democratic norms and have nothing to worry about. So in a way, it's interesting to be back here in the kind of macro political context. As a well-known writer once said, history repeats itself, or history happens twice, first as tragedy and then as farce. And obviously we seem to be living in something similar to that now. So I'm going to jump into the presentation here. Unfortunately, it looks like the screen just went black. So kind of maybe there are people. Oh, here we go. Good. And so it's really great to share this work with a community of folks that are coming together around the history and the concept of Latin America. A lot of when you hear a book about jazz, the first thing on your mind might not be Latin American and Iberian and Caribbean studies. What is, you know, jazz is a quintessentially American art form. It's America's classical music. Why would a Latin American center, you know, ask someone like me to give a talk on this subject? Well, what's interesting is there have been a lot of Latin American intellectuals who have seen in jazz and African American music practice more broadly a kind of model to think through their own creative work. Julio Cortázar, famous Argentinian writer in exile, who actually, I think, penned these words from Paris when he was in exile, resisting dictatorships and calling them out, especially during the Guerra Sucia in El Proceso in Argentina. He was reflecting on a blues in his novel Hopscotch, written by Mamie Daydune, who we're going to listen to in a second. And he said that this blues is inevitable, is rain and bread and salt, something completely beyond national ritual, sacred traditions, language, and folklore. Something beyond all of those things. A cloud without frontiers, a spy of air and water, an archetypal form, something from before and from below. He continues and says that this blues is a betrayed origin, revealing how perhaps there had been other paths than this one, and maybe not the only one or the best one. There's so much to unpack here that is quite beautiful. This idea that the blues is somehow something from below, like a history from below, that's not represented by the winners and the narrative builders of our kind of contemporary nation states. And that it also pointed to a sort of alternative modernity, right? A different future or different kinds of futurities that weren't reflected in global economic and political development as they had consecrated in the 1970s world. And so, here we have an Argentinian writer in Paris, one of probably the premier modernists of the Latin American novel, really checking out this kind of obscure recording of a 1905 blues. And this blues, it's something that ironically has really eluded most jazz historiography and most jazz writers, and yet Cortázar really hones in on it. Mamie Daydune's signature composition was called A Blues You Had to Know in Turn of the Century New Orleans. There's no photo available of her. She passed away when she was in her early 30s to tuberculosis, like many other African Americans and working class African Americans in this time period in New Orleans, as unfortunately Reconstruction was replaced by Jim Crow and de jure segregation. Something that's interesting about this piece, which is really relevant to the whole argument of the book, and you'll hope get to hear this a little bit tonight, is that this piece, when we think of the blues, we often think of what's essentially Southern African American tradition, and it certainly is, but it's also overlaid with a lot of rhythmic cells that would be associated with Cuba and Haiti and the Caribbean, specifically this rhythm called the tresillo, which goes also its associated sister or parents or coupled rhythm, the habanera. So kind of what's happening in this piece is you have a sort of blues language in her right hand. This is from a transcription of Jelly Roll Morton that performed the piece, her student. And the right hand, you have this kind of musical language that's evocative of the United States South and the Delta blues and African American Southern culture. And the left hand, you have this kind of Afro-Caribbean complex of rhythms and sounds. And so kind of the space between her hands represents this sort of diasporic formation that's coming together in a single individual. And so it's so interesting that Cortázar, whose national music, tango, is also inflected by some of these same rhythms, really honed in on this piece and saw it as an alternative vision of modernity, one that was perhaps more inclusive and less racially hierarchical. I'll just play a little excerpt of this. As I mentioned, she died very young, in her 30s. In the early 1910s, and she never recorded this piece herself. It was recorded by her student, Jelly Roll Morton. I'm going to play for you a version of the piece that myself and others in Pittsburgh played with Ayanna Sade as a kind of interpretation of this piece, and then I'll play for you some of the kind of archival recordings, and then we can kind of assess what. But this is perhaps. Oh, you're not seeing this because it is stuck in the presenter mode. Let me get out of this and go into here. There we go. I'll go back to it's not possible to embed a 2-hour Vimeo clip in here.
My baby away. Took my baby up. Since 17, gonna bring them back someday. Standing on the corner with my feet soaking wet.
Boom, bop, bum, bum.
On
Da,
the
da.
corner with my feet soaking wet.
That's the habanero rhythm that I was describing.
Asking for help from everyone I beg.
Okay, so we had some miscommunication on when the solo would start there, so we're not going to see that part. But anyway, this is jazz. This is the kind of a conversational communal art form where perfection is imperfect, right? And so anyway, what's going on in this song? Well, the lyrics are quite revealing, especially this section here. I got a husband and I got a kid man too. My husband can't do what my kid man can do. I like the way he cooked my cabbage for me. Looked like he set my natural soul free. Now, he probably this kid man probably was a good cook, but I think this is not I don't think this is a euphemism for cooking in the kitchen. I think here Mamie Daydune is celebrating having an orgasm outside of her marriage, and that's actually a form of spiritual liberation. Okay, now this is not this isn't WAP by Cardi B. This isn't 2017. This is 1897, 1901 New Orleans, right? We're about to enter one of the most regressive, repressive, fascist governments, or in fact, it was already in power. This is, of course, the Southern segregated governments that literally made declarations like this illegal. There's other blues singers in this time period, like Ma Rainey, who celebrate having lesbian relationships. These were punishable offenses with jail time. So this is a pretty powerful form of protest that is super intersectional. There's also a comment on poverty and feminized poverty. And then the most revealing lyric here is actually the beginning. The 219 train actually refers to a train that the 219 took my baby away depicts how sex workers were trafficked from New Orleans to Texas Gulf oil boom towns as a metaphor for the lost promises of emancipation, and a comment on the counter-revolution that had destroyed Reconstruction's radical promise. Reconstruction was a really dynamic time period in the US South when Black legislatures wielded significant power in state governments in Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina. They actually produced, in some ways, Louisiana's most progressive state constitution to this day. So 219 was a train that basically disappeared sex workers that were unable to kind of write about their accounts or represent themselves except in the blues. And so that's what Mamie Daydune was doing. This song viscerally depicts the violence of capitalism in early 20th century New Orleans, where most jazz musicians worked in a gentrified red light district or legalized prostitution district called Storyville. This was a thriving prostitution market sanctioned by the city, funded by major banks, and marketed in the city's promotional materials to Northern and European tourists. So basically, Southern planters and paramilitary groups destroyed Reconstruction and forced Africans more broadly, and African-American women in particular, into these low-wage sex work jobs in Storyville, which was not like, again, this wasn't sort of an underground economy. This was a very above-ground economy. This was a very gentrified, capital-intensive enterprise. Okay, so we had discussed a little bit the possible influences of these rhythms here, the habanero, the tresillo. What could those mean? Okay, I know, I'm sorry, folks. I'll do my best, but I do like to interact with the slides, so I'll speak up if I start to walk. Thank you to all of you who are joining us from afar. It's great to see you here. So we've been discussing what the possible resonance and balance of these rhythms are. And what's interesting is that Mamie Daydune was the daughter of Haitian-descended activist Rodolphe Daydune, who was one of the main organizers of several sit-in campaigns on segregated train cars in the 1890s. And his uncle, Rodolphe's uncle, was actually an ambassador for Haiti to the United States and encouraged Black emigration there. So she was actually descended from pretty high up activists who had international relations and connections to Haiti, again, during a time when Haiti was not diplomatically recognized by the United States. So members of the Day-Dune family were actively connected to their Haitian heritage and its example as a decolonial nation. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is my first time at a Latin American Studies talk, and I know, or presenting this book in a Latin American Studies context, and I know we're a very progressive, borderless, boundaryless Latin American, Caribbean, Iberian Studies program here, but there are some Latin Americanists who would debate Haiti's inclusion into what's called Latin America. And the debate on and the exclusion of Haiti from Latin America is not simply a question of geography, linguistic nationalism, or some kind of specific racial project associated with mestizaje, right? I think that's, those who would sort of say that Latin America belongs to the Hispanophone and Lusophone spheres would say, the French Caribbean has a different history, a different trajectory, different process of racial mixture. I would argue that Latin American as a political project has always pointed to this sort of alternative modernity that Cortázar spoke to earlier, what Jamie Sanders describes as American Republican modernity, which he contrasts with the United States in the 19th century. And that logic today is actually enshrined in the plurinational constitutions in nation states like Bolivia and otherwise. And if we're talking about Latin America as a political project in this way, Haiti is central to that project. Not just because it actually and actively supported Latin American revolutions and revolutionaries from Mexico to Simón Bolívar, but also because it actually forced those revolutionaries to make anti-slavery a major part of their agenda, right? These nation states, these emergent nation states in the 1820s and 1830s maintained active diplomatic relations with Haiti, and some leaders like Vicente Guerrero, the second president of Mexico, and its first and possibly only person who claimed Afro-descendant heritage, was assassinated precisely because he was trying to maintain this relationship with Haiti. So I think Haiti is a central part of the construction of Latin America, and actually understanding what makes Haiti Latin American also helps us understand what made New Orleans part of Latin America, at least until it was colonized by the United States, because New Orleans had a French and then Spanish governor, and it had a similar tripartite racial system that each other Latin American nation state had. And it also experienced a very similar project of Republican modernity that was actively anti-racist and connected to a kind of renewed vision of the Republic that would not only challenge chattel slavery, but its attendant racial hierarchies. So this connection between Miami-Dade Dunes and Haiti is central to understanding why Cortázar understood jazz to be an archetypal form, something from before and below. And as the Haitian proverb says, "Crayon pep la pen gan gomme," the people's pen has no eraser. These songs, like 219 Blues, were the people's pen. This was a way that those marginalized and degraded by white supremacy and official historiography could leave a historical record that has no eraser, that would be transmitted in the annals and archives of popular consciousness. And similarly, for artists like Miami-Dade Dune, this was from Jean Cousteau Rousseau, a Creole of color poet from Louisiana who moved to Haiti. Pour nous être Louisian, c'est être Haitien. For us to be a Louisianan is to be Haitian. These folks, this was written in 1862, right after New Orleans was liberated by the Union Army. These folks saw themselves as part of a Latin American, Haitian, Pan-Caribbean project. Not all of them, and here I'm speaking about French-speaking mixed race people and African-descended people in New Orleans, not all of them, but definitely the most progressive elements of them. And those are the communities and folks that we're going to be focusing on today, because it's precisely that community that raised and reared a generation of jazz musicians a decade or generation later, like Jelly Roll Morton and Miami-Dade Dune. So in my research going through the Hogan Jazz Archive, trying to look at these connections between Haiti and Latin American culture in New Orleans, I came across a really interesting recording. This is a recording This is an excerpt of an interview between Alice Zeno, who's the woman on the left there, George Lewis, who is there's actually another George Lewis who teaches at Columbia now. This is not the same George Lewis. This is George Lewis, a very well-known clarinet player who was part of the New Orleans revival movement in the 1950s and 60s. And his mother, Alice Zeno, claimed to remember a song from Africa because her grandmother was a Senegambian, in her words, enslaved woman who was born in West Africa. And so these interviewers are really interested in this African song, and they are asking her to sing it. So let's listen to what happens.
The folk songs when you were young, do you remember any of those songs you heard?
Well, I was just telling George, I said, George, as many as I knew, I just can't remember nothing. Now, I can remember, but that's not French, it's, comment Jamaïque? Jamaica.
And remember, they're asking her to sing an African song, right? They're like, please sing the African song. So she says, this is the song I can remember.
And Jamaïque.
You told me.
In Haiti, from Haiti.
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 Well, that's Creole. That's Creole.
What?
Haiti.
Haiti is Creole?
Yeah.
They have a Creole down there.
Haiti?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I believe it is, because I'll tell you, the French song that I know is mostly mixed up. Too tight.
The folk songs when you were young, do you remember any of those songs?
Creole. Coup de mer, that's Creole. La fin est tuée, déjà beaucoup de mer, that's Creole.
And what is that song about?
Well, it was when they had the revolution in Haiti, they call it. And they had Prince Jeffra, and he had to come to do for them, to help them out, because they were starving. The mothers were starving. You notice they say la faim est tuée, la faim est tuée. That means hunger killed many mothers.
Do you know any other songs?
So that's so interesting that they have no follow-up questions about this remarkably preserved song that is between 100 and 150 years old in her memory, that she says is from the Haitian Revolution. And it's not the African song they were looking for, because that's the kind of narrative that, especially in 1959, this is sort of the Alan Lomaxian narrative that jazz is the fusion of African and European culture. Latin America and the Caribbean are just not, or Haiti is not part of this historiography. And I'm pretty sure she did not just make up a song in antique French and Creole and Haitian Creole just out of the blue, right? And she's 95 at this point. So what's interesting is that this song is not from the Haitian Revolution. Prince Giffard that she's mentioning, they made Faustin leave by the order of Renard. This is Prince Giffard. He overthrew an emperor in Haiti named Soloke, and so this is actually dated probably to the late 1850s, which would make sense because she was born in 62, 63. Still, it shows that there was a trans-Caribbean circuit of songs and political information that was being passed through songs, and that for some reason this song represented something very important on the eve of emancipation. Okay, so for the remainder of my talk, I'd like to ask the questions that the interviewers didn't. What made this song circulate to Louisiana, and what made it so resonant? So I'm going to call this section the Sonic Winds. Now, I do realize we got started a little bit late, and it's already 12:35, and there's, there may or may not be 70 slides to get through, and we're on the 13th one. So, but I deliberately overload the information so that I can kind of weave around and see what's kind of relevant and going. But I do want to start with a different location. I'd like to time travel a bit. Right now we're in 1959, 1960, singing a song from 1856. We're going to go even farther back to 1799, and we're going to go to a different country in the Caribbean, Jamaica. And this is the end of 1799, when Jamaica's colonial government was reeling. They were freaking out because of a failed attempt to initiate a slave revolt by a Sephardic Jewish person named Isaac Sasaportas, who was good friends with Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian, the Saint-Domingue state at the time. And Jamaica's House of Commons feared a successful slave revolution in Jamaica. They actually convened a House of Commons sessions to talk about the prospect of what they called a Santo Domingo. And a man named C. Mumford was called to present to this body of plantation owners and enslavers and the colonial government that supported them. He was actually what we would call a refugee slave owner from Saint-Domingue. He was someone who owned enslaved people in what would become Haiti, and he fled to Jamaica, which was a pretty common thing to do during the Haitian Revolution. And he had been called to offer his expertise on what they called the French blacks introduced to the internal parts of this island. So not only enslavers, but their so-called property were forced to migrate into Jamaica and other Caribbean countries. And he was asked if these quote unquote French blacks might be dangerous. And he related his own experience during the revolution. He said, after the evacuation was announced and the island was to be given up entirely, the blacks became uncommonly insolent and used to form in small parties, spoke of liberty, and at night sang Republican songs. He was surprised that my own servant, who attended me for 14 years, who accompanied me to America in 1795, and who by his faithful conduct I repose the greatest confidence in, would be moved by such anthems. He continues, he deserted from me the day before we evacuated the Kayamites, and he sent me word that he was as free as I was. Now, his very admission of being surprised by this is a good reminder that we should read these accounts of slaveholders with tremendous caution, right? Everything that they contribute to the archive is undergirded by immense psychological and epistemological violence that did not see their quote unquote enslaved African property as human beings. And yet it is still striking how fearful he was of the songs of freedom, of the pernicious influence of this music and how it impacted his once faithful servant. He said, later he said, when these French blacks are acquainted with the English Creole language, they may communicate ideas and form prejudices to the interests of the colony. But as Mumford likely suspected, music could ensure that ideals might be communicated before the requisite English was necessary, because as we all know, music is a universal language. Now, that's not the only evidence of Haitian Revolution-inspired music in Jamaica. According to an anonymous garrison commander in 1791, he said, many slaves here are very inquisitive and intelligent and are immediately informed of every kind of news that arrives. I do not hear of their having shown any signs of revolt, although, and this is what is so interesting here, they have composed songs of the blacks having made a rebellion at Hispaniola or Saint-Domingue with their usual chorus to it. I wonder what the usual chorus refers to. And I have not a doubt that there are numbers who are ripe for any mischief, and whenever insurrection begins, it will be on the north side of the island, which is the part of the island that borders Saint-Domingue and Haiti. And so that was 1791. Now let's fast forward to 1816. Here, a chorus sang by enslaved Africans accompanied a large-scale uprising. And here is the chorus, what we to do, take force with force. So this was sung by over 250 enslaved people, which included, according to one overseer, one black ascertained to have stolen over into the island from Santo Domingo, Haiti, who had played a leadership role. So this person who stole over into the island was actually a Haitian who came to Jamaica voluntarily to incite a revolt, and he did so through song. So this is just one Caribbean country, right? This is just Jamaica. You can imagine that this was not just localized in Jamaica. In his pioneering work, The Common Wind, historian Julius Scott details a transatlantic informational pipeline through which mobile peoples in the African diaspora, here we would talk about Maroons or people that escaped from enslavement, free black sailors, which there was a considerable number of, and black women merchants, connected Afro-American communities across the Atlantic world to a shared knowledge of and will to struggle in the age of the Haitian Revolution. That is, that they actually shared news of the Haitian Revolution, and in sharing this news, they encouraged others to revolt, that it was possible to win. He refers to those who risked death to shepherd this rumor, gossip, and news as plantation dissidents whose subaltern creative labor bound together the societies of Afro-America. So some of the questions I tried to answer in my book, Grassroots Democracy, was how did song and sound shape and materialize the common wind? Because as we see in Alizeno's song, and even in Mammy's Blues, these songs and these sounds continue into the development of jazz and really throughout the entire 19th century. How were Maroons, runaways from enslavement, bearers of news and new subjectivities, new ways of being in the world through sound? And how did waves of creolization or cultural change in the antebellum era prefigure and inform future social movements? I'm just going to give you one little map here, and this map is actually has some new songs that I haven't added yet. In doing these kind of Pan-American research and going to all these kind of colonial archives and online databases, I found a song in Venezuela in 1801 that referenced the Haitian Revolution, a song in Martinique in 1803, which supposedly was brought by Haitians who had stolen away to Martinique. These are all in the context of kind of revolts or uprisings. A song in Curacao in 1795, it's off the map. Santiago de Cuba in 1807. New Orleans in 1795. And Jamaica, as we just saw, in 1816. Now, these folks who were spreading these songs, right, they didn't give a crap if you were, quote unquote, part of Latin America, or if you were a Spanish colony or a Dutch colony or an English colony or a French colony. They were trying to free people, right, from slavery and from colonialism, because Haiti was unlike the United States Revolution, was simultaneously a revolution against not only colonialism, but slavery and the entire plantation system of production. Now, some Haitianist here is going to say, well, future Haitians heads of states did not abolish the plantation, but by and large, they were unsuccessful in reproducing that form of servitude. These songs are quite incredible to read about. We don't have time here. I encourage you to check out the book. If anyone just wants the PDF of the book, don't tell my publisher. I'm happy to share it with you, okay? Because I want this information to be as common as the common wind was that we're reading about here. But what's interesting is that exploring the aesthetics of the Haitian Revolution's voluntary and involuntary diaspora, because some folks were forced to migrate, helps us hear just what made New Orleans a Caribbean and colonized Latin American city, with some resonant implications for early jazz. Now, typically here, I would do a lengthy section on music, it's Marinage, and I would show you all these examples of inspiring musical maroons that escaped enslavement by playing music on steamboats, and got to Canada by disguising themselves as free musicians or tricking people. I would talk about how Sidney Bechet claimed a maroon as an ancestor, even though he actually didn't have one, but Sidney Bechet is a famous clarinetist. I would talk about this person named Pierre, who played tambourine in barbershops in New Orleans. I would talk about how barbershops were independent Black institutions also in Venezuela, where revolutionary schools where Black and mulatto youth were educated by improvised teachers who taught how to read and comb hair, write and shave at the same time. That's related by Don Simon Rodriguez, who was Bolivar's childhood tutor. I would talk about barbershops as important institutions in the US South, where music was often played, and where stories of the Underground Railroad and the Haitian Revolution were shared. I would talk about how W.E.B. Du Bois's father was a barber from Haiti. I would show you all kinds of cool documents from police records that arrested maroons or escaped enslaved people who had musical instruments, including clarinets and trombones, which would later become New Orleans' second lining traditions. We would do all of that, but here we're going to focus more on how the concept of marinage as a musical activity and looking beyond the border opened up African Americans and Afro-Creole communities in New Orleans to thinking about aligning themselves with Latin America and Mexico in particular. Because that's the most pertinent, I think, to today. Solomon Northup, does anyone know who this individual is? He wrote the book 12 Years a Slave. He actually talked about how when he was enslaved in Louisiana, he said, the news of the US victory filled the great house with rejoicing, but produced only sorrow and disappointment in the slave cabin. He's talking here about the US-Mexican War. These enslaved people were following the US-Mexican War, which is when obviously the United States annexes, colonizes Texas and really the entire western half of what is now the United States. According to Northup, enslaved people paid close attention to the political events that led to the US-Mexican War and saw Mexico as a military power capable of delivering them from slavery. It had not been long since a concerted movement of mass exodus to Mexico had been organized by an enslaved man named Lou on his plantation. Also interesting in this regard is Veracruz emerged as an important, if you don't know where Veracruz is, no, it's all good. Here, equidistant to Havana in New Orleans. At times, the biggest trading partner in New Orleans was Veracruz. Veracruz emerged as an important destination for African-American runaways. In August 1855, John T. Pickett, the U.S. consul in Veracruz, complained that there are a large number of refugiated slaves from the states of Louisiana, Texas, who are now considered worthy and peaceful Mexican citizens. He was furious that Veracruz was fully abolitionized, he said. Veracruz also has a long-standing Afro-Mexican community that continues to play forms like son jarocho, which are broadly coded as Afro-Mexican genre. And here you have an artist, sorry, Zoom people, playing a tololoche, which is a bass-like instrument that is theorized to have Mayan antecedents, and he's playing it with his a kind of pick or nail or something with his toes. He's playing a revel, a sort of power of kind of resonant violin, and he's also playing a jarana with something with his mouth. So he's playing three instruments at the same time. And we don't know anything about this musician except that a French painter found him fascinating. He also appears to have a chicken coop, so maybe he's practicing a form of subsistence agriculture or some level of self-sufficiency. So this is the kind of musical information and literacy that was being transmitted with these Maroon musicians, right? That they weren't just passing on news of revolts and new ideas, but they're also passing on new playing techniques. Again, we don't know if this is a African-American Southerner from Texas or Louisiana who ran away to Veracruz, or someone who had been a descendant of enslaved people who had been in Veracruz for generations. Now, this is really something that I want to bring attention to conclude the talk, and then I'll open it up for some questions and discussion. In 1857 to 1860, a group of Afro Creoles in New Orleans, free people of color, were invited by the Mexican government to build a commune that they called the Colonia de Eureka. It's a planned community. As you can see, they've got all these nice plots, and they had housing for 62 times 8. So sorry, I can't do the math right now. I'm not a STEM guy. But quite a few people, hundreds of Creoles of color, of Afro-descendant people from Louisiana. They invited them. This was on the eve of the Civil War. People didn't know the Civil War was about to happen. The civil rights of these free people of color, already quite limited in the U.S. South at that time, was becoming even more limited. So Benito Juarez and the Veracruzian government invited them to build this, and they have got these great plazas, like the Plaza of Cowboys, and they've got streets named after Alejandro Dumas, the famous novelist, Victor Séjour, a famous Creole of color novelist, and Lucien Lampert, a Afro-Louisianan pianist who was active in France at that time. So they kind of created this beautiful intentional community. They were going to practice subsistence agriculture. This was widely commented upon in the Mexican press. El Siglo XIX wrote, "We believe that the establishment of Black colonies honors our country, whose individuals come to enjoy the rights of man that our fundamental code grants without distinction to all races." Those are powerful words in 1857, okay? Now, I'm not saying Mexico was totally anti-racist country. There were also periodicals that said terrible racist things, specifically this one, The Extraordinary, which was actually written by white expats in Mexico who denounced the Mexican government for creating these colonies. But the point is that there were some elements of progressive Mexican society that saw themselves as allied with the Black struggle and invited educated Black people to move to this space, as well as emancipated or Maroon communities that built communities here as well, right? Now, why is this relevant to jazz? Because two really important clarinetists are born in this colony or this commune. They move back to New Orleans. That's Lorenzo Tio and Louis Tio. And Lorenzo Tio comes back to New Orleans in 1881, and he plays at this festival here. This is a festival that's honoring cotton, which was pretty dystopian. This is after really Jim Crow is now starting to consolidate. He plays at this festival with someone named Daniel A. Straker. Straker was a Barbados-born educator who was active in Reconstruction, and Straker organized and gave speeches calling for the prejudice of caste and the denial of equal rights to disappear from us forever. He's speaking these words at a 3,000 large audience at a cotton festival, sort of protesting this kind of fascist turn. So the TOs were active in this kind of political moment in the 1880s. They go on to teach musicians like Jimmy Noon, Sidney Bechet, George Baquet, a really influential group of clarinetists who become early jazz musicians. Last thing, how did this happen? You know, how did Benito Juarez make contact with these parents and these communities who would produce early jazz musicians in a generation later? Turns out Benito Juarez spent a lot of time in New Orleans, at least a few years in the 1850s when he was exiled by Santa Anna. He's a very conservative Mexican president. And Benito Juarez and other Mexican exiles like Jose Maria Mata actually developed their plan for the La Reforma in Mexico. In New Orleans. They actually planned a revolution, basically, from New Orleans, where they were rolling tobacco with free people of color and enslaved people. Tobacco rolling was a Caribbean transatlantic trade. The Tios, for their part, rolled tobacco in Veracruz some years later. So here they are, rolling tobacco. James Weldon Johnson writes about how as an African-American man, he learned how to sing in Spanish working with Cuban tobacco rollers in Florida. This was a very oral space. Ideas could be shared on these tabaquero floors, and oftentimes someone would read a newspaper, usually a radical newspaper, the leading ideas of the time: Latin American independence, anarchism, socialism, workers' cooperatives, etc. Benito Juarez, of course, goes on to defend, not only lead La Reforma, but defend his country from a new imperialist invasion led by Maximilian, where the Habsburg basically Napoleon III tried to impose a French-backed Habsburg emperor in Mexico, and he did not succeed. He was killed by Benito Juarez, and it was a resounding victory for the Americas, honored in songs like La Paloma, which modern renditions of this song actually depict Maximiliano being killed by Juarez as a sort of repudiation of this neo-imperialism. What's interesting is that this song was sung in New Orleans during this time period. It was popularized by large military bands that were performing in New Orleans that were invited to the city in the 1880s, and they helped spread some of these rhythms that we've discussed, the habanera, tresillo, and cinquillo, kind of building on that earlier wave of Haitian Mexican creolization. So a lot to unpack here. Like I said, we could have a whole week-long symposium, and I could go through all the themes of the book. But I just really like this last quote here by Sidney Bechet: "Each person was the other person's music." I feel like the intense relationality and thinking across borders and linguistic spaces really leads to this kind of intersubjective consciousness that we see in this music. And I truly feel like that's a legacy of I don't know, Latin American ideas and modernism imbued in this art form. So thank you so much for your time today. And yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. And I'll open it up for any questions that you might have. Yeah, I'm going to open the chat right now. Okay.
I really like the effort to center the history of reversal jazz, maybe more but connected to other spaces.
Mm-hmm.
The connection to I don't know if you can answer this question. This is more out of curiosity to further decenter that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you thought about jazz as just one of the styles of music that emerges in the circuit Caribbean.
Yeah.
We put a lot of emphasis on jazz as a sort of difference. It's exceptional in some ways, and it spreads to the rest of the world. But my intuition is that it was just one of those styles of music that grew once people were here in slave plantations.
Mm-hmm.
And to reform their music in the process. I'm thinking being a French Caribbean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's these arguments back and forth about, did jazz wants to be
Mm-hmm.
But what if you didn't think of it this way, but, use that model you have proposed to really think about the fact that similar forms of music emerge in all of these different places, and sort of evolve in their own ways, but they are nonetheless connected. Have you had any thoughts?
Yes, it's a great. Yeah, I'm going to rehash the question from Professor Kamal. Johannes, I need you here. No, I'm just kidding. Jazz is important, right? Okay, see you later. Sorry, we just had a jazz professor leave the room. He's like, I can't stay here with this one. No, I guess I've struggled with this question. Like, is there something important about jazz's distinctiveness, right? Or is this like one of the many Afro-Latin X art forms that are percolating across the Caribbean and the Americas that are all kind of singing a similar song, right? One thing that separates, okay, so if we're just talking at the level of musical analysis, which I know is not necessarily, but I do think that the music, one thing I try to do in the book is show how musical aesthetics do map kind of social and ideological formations, that there's a connection between geography and sound, and I think this is, relevant, right? Because, even today, people mark territory, mark their space, mark their identity with what music they listen to, right? The East Coast hip hop versus West Coast hip hop, maybe less relevant now, but that, is the thing that most recently comes to mind. The Delta blues, right? That there are Son Jarocho so tied to Veracruz, or now even at the US-Mexican border, it's kind of interesting Son Jarocho movement. So I guess one big thing, so I deal with this a lot in the third chapter of this book, and I kind of try to tackle this head on. What the Latin Americanists who want to emphasize jazz's sort of like unity and maybe dissolving into this panoply of forms is that, and this really does upset some African-American musicologists that I know, and some don't feel upset by it, is that in its most simplistic form, it erases the singularity of the African-American experience in the United States, whose internal slave breeding system, because the transatlantic slave trade was cut off in 1804, was monstrous, right? It commodified a human reproduction at a scale that had never been seen before, and produced very specific legacies of indenture and commodification. But it led to a form called the blues that is not present in these forms, right? So what is present are these rhythmic traditions, right? But the minor pentatonic scale with the flat five and the gospel scale with a major pentatonic scale with a flat third, where those sort of tonalities are blending into one another, and it's neither minor nor major. That is very specific to U.S. I mean, seriously, like if you read, if you go through Danson scores, you know what I mean? For instance, just to use another parallel form, you're not going to find that specific tonal concept. There's also an emphasis on 12/8 and 6/8 in the blues, and these forms, while they do have their own polyrhythm and polytemporality, there is like this kind of 4/3 feeling that's happening. They tend to be in 2/4 or 4/4. So instead of like da 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 do da da do da da 1 2 3 4, it's a da 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 da, right? Or da 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 da, right? Or da 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 da. They all kind of fit within these 2/4 frameworks. Again, I'm casting a wide net here, so I'm sure like Chang, you can make an exception with Chang Gui. There's all these different spaces, but anyway, African-American musicologists feel that, and see, or those who speak for them, like Thomas Brothers. There's a famous guy at Duke named Thomas Brothers. Sorry to answer your question so long, but he's basically like, screw all of that. This is just Black music. This focus on the Caribbean is misguided. You know what I mean? So there's people that don't even leave room for that. But I think there is some truth to say that there is a unique tradition in the US South that's combining with these. And that doesn't remove the specificity of either of them, and it connects it to a larger historical project. So that's kind of why I do hold on to that concept of jazz. I hope that's a good enough answer for you. Okay, sure. Yeah. Peggy has a question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I feel like it was encyclopedic today, but anyway, I'm interested in this idea of the vertical commune. In Sullivan, I've been excited to hear this
Yeah.
But he forgets the idea of the strength of allies.
Uh-huh.
But I'm just wondering, what map of the future can music chart for the times that we are in right now? I think that this idea of a music map, dance map, or the arts is gonna be crucial because it combines, many elements that maybe in political, street organizing, and business. So what kind of map do you see on the music right now?
Yeah, great question, Professor Choi. Professor Choi's question was, for those on Zoom, what map of the future can music chart now? Music and dance. There's an amazing documentary about hip hop in Palestine called Slingshot Hip Hop, and I always use that tool. I always use that documentary to teach Palestinian history to students because one of the main points is in that film is that the social conditions of both Palestinian communities in Gaza and the West Bank and in Israel itself, like LID, for map very strongly onto urban communities in Black America. And so when they're hearing Tupac sing about being brutalized or rap about being brutalized by the police, they relate not only similar experiences, but see similar architecture, similar kind of signs of coloniality. And then what's interesting is that the film itself shows how artists are trying to collaborate across these imposed divisions by the occupation, that Gazan-based artists can't go to the West Bank, et cetera. And you're getting a kind of map of these empires and they're cross-cutting different administrative systems through how the musicians can and can't collaborate. But you're also getting this connection between, again, this music, jazz, became a metaphor for subaltern anti-colonial resistance and U.S. imperialism in the 1920s and 30s. Hip hop has played a very similar role today. It's hard to theorize the present. I don't do the present. I think it's too complicated. I'm living it. Let's figure it out in 30 years. Sorry, that's a cop out. I mean, I interact with it as an activist and a community organizer, and I try to bring living communities and living artists together. But it's to zoom out and think the moment like this. I probably have to leave that to someone more talented than myself. But I'm sorry if that's a cop out answer. I'm just trying to say that we don't know what the map of the future is going to look like. In some ways, music prefigures it, and then it takes someone with a visual consciousness to sort of triangulate it and systematize it in this way. I don't know, do you think that's a cop-out answer? Okay, I think I gave you a pretty good answer, but okay. Yeah, good question. Yeah, yeah. So one thing I'd like to do is create like a more popular education version of this. I'm working with a graphic artist to create a kind of historical graphic novel version of this that might focus on the bigger themes, or maybe every chapter is a sort of sub piece. And then I'm asking that artist to create layers so that I can have an animator turn it into kind of like animated film, and then I can actually have the music interspersed with the piece. And so maybe we don't have recordings of a lot of this, so we'll do our best to interpret it from the limited archival information we have. So that could be a resource not only for undergraduates and graduate students, but maybe in the high school level and just kind of interested adults. I think one of the big takeaways from the book is that musicians were never just musicians, right? They were community organizers. Sometimes they worked in the sex industry. They were dock workers. They were farmers. They organized strikes. And similarly, I don't think historians should, quote unquote, just be historians. Like, we should try to work in different mediums and fields and try to embody the lessons and practices that we're learning about. So that's my next kind of like project. But then I'm also thinking about working on a book. I have concepts of a plan to work on like maybe like a sequel to this book in a way that would look at the spread of jazz in the Caribbean during the Monroe Doctrine and the U.S. occupation of different island nations and Latin American countries, and how jazz was sort of a double-edged sword because it represented U.S. cultural hegemony, but it also opened up a space for Afro-diasporic and even indigenous practice. One of the artists I'm looking at is a Oaxacan banjo player who combined indigenous Mixteca traditions with jazz and was an organizer in the Isthmus, which is a big site of struggle today. And so there's a lot of stories like that that aren't in the kind of dominant jazz historiography, precisely for the reasons that you outlined earlier. So those are my next two things I think I'm thinking about. Thanks.